Good evening. Welcome to our fall 2021 Dr. J.T. Vincent Liu lecture this evening. We are happy to be able to resume this series tonight after a pause of more than a year because of the precautions due to the COVID pandemic. We are expecting over 200 persons tonight via Zoom, and we have many of our sisters here in Sparkill gathered in our community room to view tonight's session on the large screen. You are all so very welcome. The Dr. J.T. Vincent Liu lectures are made possible by a generous gift that enables us to offer educational opportunities on social justice issues. Dr. Liu shared the Sparkill Dominicans' deep commitment to social justice, and these lectures are given in his memory, and they perpetuate Dr. Liu's legacy as a great humanitarian. Following the introduction of our distinguished speaker, we will begin with a brief prayer, followed by Dr. Garrido's presentation, which will last about 45 minutes. At the end of her presentation, we'll take a 5-minute break. During the break, you'll have the opportunity to post questions or comments for Dr. Garrido by means of the Q&A function on this Zoom webinar format. And following the break, Dr. Garrido will answer your questions and respond to your comments for about 15 minutes. For those of you who may not have participated in a Zoom webinar format before, you will notice that the only persons that can be seen on the screen are myself and our speaker. So you do not need to worry about having to choose a speaker or gallery view. And as participants, you may post using the Q&A function, which you see at the bottom of your screen, but you're not able to speak or be seen by the group. So you can relax, no one's watching you. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Ann Garrido is an associate professor of homiletics at the Aquinas Institute in St. Louis. While her first passion is teaching, for the past 15 years, she has found herself increasingly drawn into administrative roles, and that includes, at varying points in time, serving as the school's director of the Doctorate of Ministry and Preaching program, director of the Master of Arts in Pastoral Studies for the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, the director of Field Education, the director of Distance Learning, and the director of the Aquinas Ministry Integration Project. That's a lot of directing, Ann. Ann has served as senior editor of Human Development magazine and is the author of numerous books, including the award-winning volumes Redeeming Administration in 2013, Redeeming Conflict in 2016, and her newest publication, Let's Talk About Truth, in 2020, all three published by Ave Maria Press. And now commits half time to traveling nationally and internationally, doing conflict education and mediation work with the Triad Consulting Group, founded by 2 members of the Harvard Negotiation Project based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ann lives in Atlanta, Georgia, where she's going to speak to us tonight. And she's married to a very patient husband and has one son whom I'm told plays a mean ukulele. So I'd like to hear that someday. So for our prayer this evening, we take our inspiration from St. Dominic. St. Dominic was often moved to tears and action by the plight of those who were suffering. How do we explain his tears? They flowed from the discipline of an open-eyed spirituality that did not miss a thing. Truth, veritas, is the motto of the order, not its defense, as is often understood, but rather its perception. Truth, to perceive truth. Keeping one's eyes open so as not to miss a thing, that can make the eyes smart. So we have the tears. So our prayer this evening. Gracious God, your kingdom is built on truth and justice. We ask your blessing this evening on Dr. Ann Garrido as she shares her research and insights with us. Be with us as we reflect on the relationship between truth and justice. Give us your eyes to see, so that we, like St. Dominic, might embrace an open-eyed spirituality that leads us to perceive your truth and to work for justice in our world. We make our prayer through Christ our Lord. So Ann, I invite you to begin your presentation. We are listening and we have open eyes.
Thank you, Sister Margaret, for the really warm welcome. I am absolutely thrilled and honored to give this fall's Dr. J.T. Vincent Liu lecture. The only thing that makes me sad right now is not to actually be at Spark Hill with so many of you in person. Over the course of my 25 plus years of affiliation with the Dominican family, my life has been touched in so many personal ways by Spark Hill Sisters in St. Louis, in Montana, and it's long been on my bucket list to get to actually visit Spark Hill, and I know that it will still happen someday. Every Spark Hill sister that I have had the privilege of meeting has exemplified this value on social justice that the Dr. Liu lecture series is eager to forward. As someone who has largely lived her professional life teaching in a Dominican house of studies, I have been constantly humbled by the courageous and the unceasing activity of the sisters in this regard. I always feel like I'm supposed to be doing more myself. And much of my own time as an academic has been dedicated to the pursuing that other great Dominican value of truth. And sometimes, sadly, those two causes of justice and truth, sometimes they feel like they're in a little bit of tension with one another. I know that I've experienced that personally. Sometimes when I'm like getting ready for class and I'm paging through kind of a dense theology book and I'm like, what am I doing here? Maybe I should be out more in like direct service or advocacy for the poor. Or I know that I've also experienced it through being part of larger Dominican family back and forth about, well, where are we supposed to focus our energies in preaching truth or in doing justice? And of course, what we would say is that these are false dichotomies, right? It's never an either or. Everything about Dominican life is a both and. But in this case, it's not even a both and, as if truth and justice are two opposing values that we need to figure out how to somehow hold together like repelling magnets or like oil and water, or even like two weights on a scale that are of opposite sides that we need to somehow keep in check and balance with each other. No, we should think about truth and justice as being more like water and wine, or like magnets of opposite poles that are flinging themselves toward one another, because truth and justice are meant for one another. And why do I say that? Well, as in all things in Dominican life, we start by rooting ourselves in the scripture. And in the Hebrew scriptures, there are a number of words that over and over again appear in what we're going to call couplets. So it's one of those words is the word truth. All the way through the Psalms, all the way through the prophets, truth is rarely mentioned ever by itself, but it's repeatedly being paired up with loving kindness, righteousness, and yes, that word of tonight, justice. So just a few examples of where we might find it. That in Psalm 111, the works of his hands are truth and justice. Or Isaiah 59, justice is turned back, righteousness stands far away, for truth has stumbled, and uprightness cannot enter. Or Jeremiah 5, if there's one who does justice, who seeks truth, then I will pardon the people. And of course, my personal favorite, as you can probably tell from the lecture, the title of tonight's lecture, Psalm 89, your kingdom is built on truth and justice. Now, the great Dominican Saint Thomas Aquinas, he fleshes out this really close relationship between truth and justice further in the Summa. And I should say that when I first began doing research on Thomas's writing for the book, Let's Talk About Truth, And I started to look at what Thomas had to say, because let me assure you that I am in no way a Thomas scholar, and that I often find his thinking and his style of writing to be very confusing or difficult to comprehend. I will say that at first I was really baffled to find much of what Thomas has to say about the topic of truth underneath his section in which he writes about justice, and kind of like this indication that truth and somehow serves a life of justice. And it took me a little while to understand what he meant by that. And I'll share what I finally figured out in a couple of minutes. But just the discovery that Thomas saw the work of truth as being at the service of justice, as a dimension of doing justice, that set my own mind spinning. And tonight, what I'd like to do is to talk about 3 nuggets of wisdom, if you will, from the Dominican tradition that point to the intertwined nature of truth and of justice. 3 nuggets that I think we want to hold onto in our lives today, so that these 2 values never get separated from one another or perceived as in tension with one another, but rather to highlight how a commitment to one implies a commitment to the other. And indeed, in our own time, urgently call us to a common project in which these 2 values merge into one cause. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, because before we get into that project, and before I even get to that nugget from Thomas that I mentioned that's found in Secunda Pars, I want to actually start with a nugget of Thomas's from the Prima Pars of the Summa to set the stage of how truth works in the service of justice. So the classical Dominican definition of truth that's rooted in the writing of Thomas Aquinas, who himself is rooted in the writing of Aristotle, and it's still the basis for the definition of truth that if you're to go into Webster's dictionary today, this is pretty much what you're going to find. Veritas et adequatio re et intellectus. And you're probably, many of you are like, okay, I do not know Latin. And I should say, I, in all honesty, do not either. So the literal translation of what Thomas is saying here is that truth is the adequation of thing and intellect. And probably many of you are like, okay, that did not help a whole lot more than the Latin. So what is it that Thomas is really trying to get at here? Thomas is basically saying that truth is having a mind that's aligned with reality. So having a picture of the thing in your head that matches with what exists in the real world. So Dominican writing on this topic of truth, it begins with the notion that there is such a thing as reality. There is a world that is out there, that a universe that exists out there. It doesn't just exist inside of my own head. And so indeed, what I perceive of reality matters not at all to reality itself. So the star Polaris out my window right now, it either exists or it doesn't exist. But Polaris's existence is not dependent on me knowing that Polaris exists or on me believing that Polaris exists. The climate right now is warming or it's not warming, but whether I believe the climate is warming does not, whether the climate's warming or not does not depend on me knowing about that or believing it. So reality is what it is, but me knowing what's real really does matter because it has consequences, not so much for reality out there, but for me, for us. There's a famous story that I think captures Thomas's intuition on this matter well. And it's probably an urban legend. It happens off the coast of Newfoundland, foggy coast of Newfoundland, between a US naval official and the Canadian authorities. And it goes like this. The American gets on their walkie-talkie or whatever it is on the boat and says, please divert your course 10 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. There's some fuzz, and then the Canadian gets on and says, recommend you divert your course 10 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. The American gets back on. This is the USS aircraft carrier Missouri. We are the second largest ship in the Atlantic fleet. We are accompanied by 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous support vessels. We demand that you divert your course 10 degrees, 10 degrees to the north, or countermeasures will be taken to ensure the safety of the ship. So a moment of pause, and the Canadian gets back on and says, "This is a lighthouse, your call." So no matter how big or how powerful that we like to think of ourselves as being, we're the ones that are in mortal peril if we have the wrong picture of reality in our minds. It's in our own best interest to have a mind that's aligned with reality. So lots of times in Dominican circles, you'll hear about truth being described as objective. And this means 2 different things. One, like we've been talking about, that reality is what it is, not necessarily what we would like it to be, but what it is. And 2, that the knowing of truth always remains before us. Now, this second one that I've named, this might need a little bit more explanation to it. For those of us who are teachers, many of you will remember, or if you've been in the past a teacher, you know how you begin the semester and you make up like your syllabus for the semester, and on the front page of that syllabus, oftentimes what you're going to have is the course objectives, which is right there up front saying, here's what we're striving for this semester. And so when we say that truth is objective, we also mean it in that sense, like truth is what we're striving for. Truth is what we're shooting for, because reality is really, really big. As one of my colleagues at Aquinas is keen to say, he would say, reality is like a bazillion volts of electricity. Most of us are dealing with about 60-watt bulbs in our brain. And even if you're one of the really lucky people who got an 80-watt bulb or a 100-watt bulb, in the big, huge scheme of things, it's not all that different, right? So it's never like we're going to be able to, as Sister said in the opening, to be able to possess reality in our brains. It's never like we're going to be able to say, I've got this all wrapped up. We're always going to be on the way. We're always going to be striving. Or the way that I've taken to framing it is that we're always going to be truthing, right? It's not like we're ever going to be at the end of the journey. Truth, it's like an exercise. It's an activity that we are always about. Because whatever I know about Polaris or Thomas Aquinas or God, for that matter, is always going to be so small in comparison to what I could know about Polaris or Aquinas or God, that I could always say that it's going to be less adequate than it is adequate. It's always so small before the grand, huge scheme of things. So truth is objective, and it always remains objective. So in essence, we got to be humble about it. And why does all this matter in the cause for justice? Because before we can figure out what the world should look like and decide the best way of getting there, we need to make sure that first we have a solid picture in our brains of what actually is, even as we humbly admit that there's always going to be more to know. Because arriving at a vision of a just world, a healthy, a whole, a healed world, that in itself, that's a complicated task. And it's not unlike the task, the very difficult task that probably some of us on this call have had to face in our own lifetime around like a really frightening health diagnosis, something like cancer, that we know that we want to get better. We know that we have a hard road ahead of us that's going to include some really difficult choices that are difficult in part precisely because the treatment options are not always crystal clear. We have to make prudential judgments like, do I go with this treatment, knowing the potential risks, or should I go in this direction? But whatever we decide, whichever road we choose, we know that the best choice is going to be the one that begins with the best facts. Because the best picture of whatever kind of cancer or disease that we have, what our genetic predisposition is, what the stats on this are, We may not always have all of the information that we wish that we had, but whatever treatment we decide to pursue, we want to make sure that it's based on what's real. And knowing what's real doesn't tell us which road to take, but at least it starts us walking in the right direction. Now let's apply that now at a communal level. In my former life, before I was a theology teacher, I was actually a history teacher. And I am in no way going to pretend that I'm not going to get too doctrinaire about what I'm about to say, because I know that there is no way, right, that I could know all that there is to know about history. But from what I can tell in my own limited experience, whenever we see the rise of a despotic governance, which serves basically the flourishing of no one but the despot himself, it begins consistently with a willful dismissal, often a persecution, of people whose particular role in society is the discovery and the sharing of facts about the real world. Scientists, journalists, oftentimes teachers in general, and that there is simultaneously at the same time a willful effort to cast doubt on the objectivity of truth. One, by spreading information that is not factually accurate and creating situations in which no one feels like they can tell what's real anymore, so that they just want to give up on striving or truthing. And or the second thing that happens is by painting a very simplistic picture that pretends to be comprehensive and explanatory of all that there is, in which there's no longer anything to be learned, because we already know all that we need to know about, and you can fill in the blank in the way that it has been filled out in so many different eras of history. We already know all that we need to know about the Jews, the Tutsis, the Rohingya, Blacks, Mexicans at the border, Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. In essence, we already have the truth. And so once again, we've given up on the act of truthing, which leads directly to the second nugget concerning this innate interrelatedness between truth and the pursuit of justice. This is the one that I hinted at in my introduction. Truthfulness in the service of justice. So in the first part of the Summa, as we noted above, Thomas writes about a fundamental desirability of having your mind aligned with reality for the sake of pure survival, yes, but also as the starting point for pursuing a good life, a better world, what we might call a life of virtue. And this is really what the second part of the Summa is dedicated to, fleshing out what does a life of virtue look like? Because virtue being those choices toward the good that we make over and over and over again, to the point where they become characteristic of our very way of being in the world. And for Thomas, as for Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, justice was one of what they call the four cardinal virtues. Cardinal coming from the Latin word cardini, which means hinge, like on a door. And if you think about, like, what does a hinge let a door do? It lets a door function as a door. If a door doesn't have a hinge, it's really just a large block of wood. And so similarly, the cardinal virtues are what allow us to live and to function as real human beings. Because without these virtues, it's impossible to live a really, truly human life. And justice for Thomas is defined as giving each person their due, making sure that everybody has what it is that they're owed. But underneath justice, Thomas then defines a couple different daughter virtues. And one of the daughter virtues of justice is truth. And here Thomas defines truth as giving each person the information that they're due. So honest information that that person is owed. So notice this is a little bit different than how we talked about truth before. Before we were talking about truth as veritas, right? Thomas's word veritas, truth is having a mind aligned with reality. Here Thomas changes the word just a little bit to veracitas. That truth here is having a mouth aligned with your mind. What we might in English maybe better call truthfulness. And we know that it's possible to have one without the other, isn't it? Because, for example, you probably know people in your own life or have seen this on the news where there's people who will strike you as incredibly honest or incredibly blunt or incredibly direct in that they say exactly what they think. But that doesn't necessarily make them right, does it? Because it's possible that your mind, your mouth could be aligned with your brain, but that your brain is not actually aligned with reality. And there's not a lot of virtue in being honest if you haven't first really tried to figure out what's real. It's also possible, though, and you've surely witnessed this too, to have somebody whose brain is aligned with reality, but what comes out of their mouth is something entirely other. And that is what we would call a lie. And all throughout history, Dominicans have been particularly sensitive to the evils of lying. And again, I wonder if this doesn't have something to do with the fact that Dominican spirituality is a spirituality that's, again, rooted in the word. And so is particularly attentive to the way that word works and functions in the world. One of the things that we can observe over and over again, let's just say, for example, in the resurrection stories of Jesus, is that having an experience, seeing the resurrected Christ, as the Gospels let us know, was clearly a really powerful experience for those who had that. It was very convicting for them. But simply hearing about Christ's resurrection from another disciple doesn't seem to have been all that convincing to anyone until that person, like Thomas, then has an experience of seeing the risen Christ and then tries to tell others and no one's going to believe them. So seeing is a very persuasive and one could say easy way of coming to belief. Hearing, it's less so. Because receiving something by way of word in a world that lacks integrity, it's a much more fragile and vulnerable way. We've all experienced being told something that later we found out wasn't real, and we feel angry about it, or we feel like we've been made a fool of. And believing something via another person's word requires placing great stock in the trustworthiness of that person who's telling you this information. And every time that a word is cheapened by someone who lies or exaggerates or tells half-truths, it makes it harder to trust in general, and it makes it then harder to function as a community. And if you take it too far, the cheapening of word actually makes it impossible to function as a society. I suspect that it is no accident that Dominican life and Dominican thought was born right at the same time as the resurgence in Europe of urban life, of complex society. And the insights that are born of that experience, I think, are even more relevant today, as more and more of us are trying to live in closer and closer vicinity with others. There's a greater division of labor and of specialized tasks in our society. And what it means is that none of us today, truly none of us, is an island unto themselves. None of us can know everything that is to be known in modern society. None of us can be a farmer and a doctor and a butcher and an astronaut and a preacher and a teacher and an auto mechanic. You get the picture. So rather, as a society, we rely moment by moment on the knowledge that other people have. Every minute of every day, you and I are making choices, trusting that the information that we have been given by others is accurate. So every time you pick up a box of cereal on the grocery store shelf, you are trusting that that list of ingredients on the side of the box are the ingredients that are actually in that box, lest your health suffer. Or every time that you go to the ATM and enter in your PIN number, you are trusting that the computer scientist who wrote that program knows what's going to happen with your money, lest you be cast into complete poverty. And every time you cross the Mario Cuomo Bridge, you are trusting that the engineer passed on the best of her knowledge that she had about the weight that that concrete could bear, lest you fall to your death. So people who are given bad, erroneous information make bad, erroneous choices, as the current investigation of the events of January 6th is making clear. So sometimes people are like, oh, well, I mean, really, wise up. You should expect that people will lie to you, and you should always go through life being suspicious. You should always make sure you do your own research, because you should know better than to trust what other people tell you. Everyone's got an agenda. Do your own thinking. And all that I would say is good luck with that. Because even when you do your own research online or even in a library, you are referring on pieces that other people have written and experiments that other people have conducted. You simply cannot in one lifetime see everything for yourself. And to live in a complex society, in addition to always being open to more information, you are going to have to be able to trust and to be trustworthy, or the whole endeavor is not going to work. Because it very may well be the case that you shouldn't trust everyone. But to return to the Summa, Thomas's point is that in any society that considers itself to be just, that would be a society in which you'd have to be able to trust everyone's words in that society. If you can't trust everyone yet, it's because you are not yet living in a just society, because you can't count on being given the information that you are due, the information that you need in order to be able to make really good choices and to live a good life. So honesty is the cornerstone of a just society. And what does that mean for us? It means that if we really care about justice, we have to also really care about honesty, about transparency, and work for structures that support it. Now, does that mean that everyone just needs to share everything that's on their minds? No. Thomas would say that not everyone is due all information. So, for example, unless I am your healthcare power of attorney or your healthcare proxy, I'm not due information to your medical records. I don't need that information for my own life to be lived well or to fulfill the job that I've been entrusted with. Thomas's point would just be that you can't put false information out there, right? So in many situations, it's totally fine to remain quiet or to even say, I'm not going to share that information. But Thomas would say that anything that we do put out there into the world had better be aligned with what we really think. Nothing false, nothing that's misleading. And quite possibly, the biggest hindrance to creating a more just, more healthy, more whole, more healed world right now is the proliferation of fake news via new social media platforms that have emerged in just the last 20 years. Not because fake news is a new thing in the history of time, right? It's been around since the days of Adam and Eve. But one, because there is now an ease of spreading globally, unlike at any other time in human history, and rendering every society simultaneously vulnerable to despotism. And two, because the ensuing polarization and confusion, it renders us incapable of together getting traction on the very pressing issues of our day, including other justice issues like the environment or vaccination or racial equity. To be able to get traction on any of these issues right now is going to require people harnessing their energies to move in the same direction. And right now, we cannot do that. This issue is hindering all of our other efforts in this regard. I'm not sure how many of you have been paying attention to Pope Francis's comments that were made on this topic earlier this week in the World Meeting of Popular Movements that's going on right now, which were in fact some of the strongest comments that he has made yet in a papacy that has been distinguished for strong comments, a strong sense of truthfulness, right? And in the middle of a very passionate litany in which each line begins, in the name of God, right? He's pleading with us. He includes, in the name of God, I ask the technology giants to stop exploiting human weakness, people's vulnerability for the sake of profits without caring about the spread of fake speech, grooming, fake news, conspiracy theories, political manipulation. In the name of God, I ask the media to stop the logic of post-truth, disinformation, defamation, slander, unhealthy attraction to dirt and scandal, and to contribute to human fraternity and empathy with those who are the most deeply damaged. Working on this topic, advocating on this topic, educating on this topic seems to me to be something that the Dominican family, with its age-old commitments to the intertwined values of justice and truth, could embrace in a particular way. Both the men and the women of the order around the globe in all different generations of community, that this would be a project that is uniquely and naturally suited to the charisms of the order. One that Dominicans are peculiarly well equipped by their tradition to take a lead on in church life. But if the global Dominican family, with all of its sponsored ministries and all of its associations and all of its associates, were to take on such a common project, there is one last nugget of wisdom from the tradition that it would need to rely on in order to sustain those efforts. And I don't want to close without saying something about being true in the service of justice. So this work of truthing that I've been talking about, this ongoing effort and striving to really seek accurate information in the midst of so much polarized content, the work of effectively confronting networks of fake news and the business models that support them, the work of entering the conversation with others who hold dearly truths other than our own, and how to figure out how to navigate what seems like impossible differences. I don't need to tell you that this kind of work is exhausting. Not so much physically, though that sometimes too, but intellectually and emotionally. When I was working on the book, Let's Talk About Truth, and then a short follow-up volume that follows it called Rules of Engagement, which is about this effort of doing truth online, on social media. There were times, I cannot tell you the number of times, when I would just get so stuck on how to communicate clearly on this topic that it was like my brain was just like a big, huge tangled knot. And I would sit for an entire morning with my cup of tea in front of a blank screen, and I would sometimes get like one sentence written by the end of the day. Or I get into conversation with someone who I really would disagree with, and I'd feel like the immensity of this problem is so great, and my heart begins to feel hopeless. It's easy to give up on one another in the middle of truthing work. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So once again, in the Dominican tradition, we go back to the Word of God for help. And I've been talking about Thomas's veritas and veracitas, but the Hebrew word for truth is the word emet. And it appears in the Bible 127 times in the Hebrew scriptures. The Gospels, as you know, were written in Greek. So this particular word doesn't appear there. But it does seem to be the basis for Jesus's very odd or quirky speech pattern, where he begins his sentences, unlike anyone else that we've ever seen in literature. Amen, I say to you, or even amen, amen, I say to you, which is that word amen, very closely related to this Hebrew word emet, sometimes translated truly, right? I say to you. So note here that this word emet has 3 letters to it. The first letter aleph, the middle letter of the alphabet mem, and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet tav. And then note also that all 3 of these letters have what in Hebrew they would call 2 feet. So notice how they all stand on the line on which they're written twice. And scholars of the Hebrew language emphasize that the very construction of the word emet might say something about how our ancient ancestors in the faith thought about truth. That truth encompasses everything from Aleph to Tav, right? The whole alphabet, from beginning to the middle to the end. And that truth is straightforward and comprehensible. In contrast, this is the Hebrew word for lie, which is the word sheker. And the word sheker also has 3 letters to it. But interestingly, all 3 of these letters come from the end of the Hebrew alphabet, and they're all mixed in order. And notice also that each of these letters only has 1 foot, right? It only touches the line 1 time. And it's this sense that a lie, if you blow on it real hard, it would just fall over, right? It easily gets itself all jumbled up. But Emet is well grounded. Emet is firm. Emet stands on 2 legs. And it's this last aspect of Emet that makes it really difficult to translate adequately into English. Because yes, Emet means much the same thing as what truth means when we hear it like in the global West, grounded in reality, honest. But Emet also has nuances beyond what we can hear. Emet is sturdy. Emet is trustworthy. Emet is stable. Emet stands the test of time. And if you lean on Emet, Emet's going to hold you up. And we have remnants of this ancient meaning of the word that are preserved in our language about marriage. So for example, if you were to ask me the question about my husband, is Mike true? My guess, I would be pretty sure that you were not asking me in that first sense of St. Thomas, does Mike exist or is he a figment of your imagination, right? I'm pretty sure, like I just saw him, he's locked in the other room right now. What I would instead hear you asking, if you said, is Mike true? You're asking, is Mike faithful? Is Mike someone who you can count on? Is it a relationship that stood the test of time? It's that sense of that, or in the marriage vows, I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, till death do we part. So ultimately, that work of truth is about hanging in there with one another, about being faithful to what it is that we started. And in that biblical sense, truth is really the only thing that can sustain us in the work of justice, especially a work of justice so difficult as the project that I've described, considering the proliferation of fake news in our time and this kind of global questioning about whether there even is such a thing as truth, whether it matters, whether it's even knowable. So dealing head on with these issues is going to take every ounce of perseverance that we have left in our bones. And it's going to bring us into knotted and confusing conversations where we won't know all of the answers. And it's going to bring us into relationships where much patience will be needed with people who we will find very annoying, even if only other members of our own Dominican family. In order to do truth in the world, we're going to need to figure out new ways of being true. And for that, we do not need to turn to Thomas, but to the witness of Dominican communities around the world, like Spark Hill, where year after year after year, for some of you, 70 plus years, right, that you have figured out how to be sister to one another, how to hang in there with one another, despite different backgrounds and different perspectives. We sometimes point to people like Thomas Aquinas as luminaries of what it means to be a champion for truth in the world, but we could just as well and should point to you who have lived in fidelity to your communities for day in and day out for all of these years. And that by the quality of the life that you're living with one another, through thick and through thin, you are teaching the world a valuable lesson simultaneously about what it means to be true and what just community looks like. Or at least we could say a community striving for justice looks like. Because justice, just like truth, is objective, right? And always remains an objective. It's never something that we could say also, oh, we possess it. So last night, I was emailing a friend about my struggle to figure out how should I end this talk tonight? And she suggested that maybe I should just stop mid-sentence and go quiet and announce, I thought I would have been struck by lightning by now. Well, this is awkward, but I've not been struck by lightning, which I guess means that it is okay, right? For us to continue this conversation, and that's what we need to be doing in the world right now. Because on more than one occasion, when I've been watching the news, I have seen a panel discussion of some sort with experts talking about what it's going to be like to live in a post-truth world. And whenever I see people pontificating on this topic, I want to say, unask that question. Because I don't think that there is any such thing as a post-truth world. We either figure out how to recover the value of truth, or we don't have a world, period. Never mind a just world. I think it's as stark as that. We either recover truth as a pathway to justice, or we die. And I believe that Dominican wisdom is needed now more than ever in history. And the question really is simply, what is the next step in forwarding and sharing this Dominican commitment to truth in the service of justice? So barring any lightning strikes in the next couple minutes, let's just take a couple of minutes, stand up and stretch if you'd like to, and to enter into chat any questions that you would like to ask. And then we can continue this conversation with one another. So at the bottom of the screen, there should be a little, on the gray bar, something that says Q&A. And if you'd like to enter in anything that you'd like to share there, I'll be checking it in just a couple of minutes.
Okay, we'll come back in 5 minutes. So use your time to write into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Ann will be back to answer your questions or comment on your comments. Thank you.
Okay, maybe another 30 seconds or so, and then I'll begin to respond to some of what's beginning to come up. Mhm. Okay, there's some great stuff that's surfacing. And so maybe let me see if I can reply to as much as I'm able to in the time that we've got, because there's a couple threads that I begin to see appearing in the questions already. Um, One person asks, what do you see as possible new ways of being true? I think that's a great question. And actually, when I said that in the talk, what I actually meant to say was continuing ways of being true, because there are so many ways of being true that already exist, right? So those who are living in community life, those who are living in deep and abiding friendships, those who are living in marriage relationships that are sustained, those are all ways that already exist of being true. But I do think there's a lot of new ways that people are forming enduring relationships with each other. And I mean, just for example, when you think about in Dominican life, like associates that are making long time commitments to being part of the Dominican community, things like that. New ways, there's been some really interesting stuff written about how in the Middle Ages, there were people who actually took vows of friendship to one another. Like, I think there's a lot, neighborhoods reestablishing themselves. People, like, whenever we're making ongoing commitment to being in relationship with people, that these are some of the ways I think that we need to continue to try to be true, and it's part of our witness to the world. Obviously, what makes that super tough is what's coming up in some of these other questions about, like, what are the skills in some ways that are necessary for being true, are skills that enable us to remain in relationship even when we don't see eye to eye, and even when we've done things that have been really hurtful to each other. So how do we develop skill sets for reconciliation or renewal of relationship that's been fractured or that's been hurt? I think in the US right now, that is that is what we continue to find over and over again, is that, like, I just keep finding I struggle to have the skills and the disposition that's necessary to continue to hang in there in conversation with people who just have such an incredibly different way of looking at reality than what I do, and different ways of judging about where do we head from here. So I think anything in our community life, parishes, families, religious communities, that we can do to educate ourselves around skills for conflict management and conflict resolution, healing, reconciliation, are all skill sets that are part of how we live our Dominican commitment to truth. Um, so a number of people are beginning to bring up questions, yeah, about beyond difficult conversations and reconciliation. Also, these questions about, like, are there boundaries to these kinds of relationships that we've got, where it's just like sometimes on this side of heaven, I have to be able to say, right now, we're not going to be able to agree on this issue. And I'm going to continue to look for ways of maybe being in relationship with you beyond agreement. So maybe there's ways of, even though politically we do not see eye to eye, maybe there's one project that we could take on with one another about something that we both care about. Maybe we're not going to be able to talk about this right now, but we can continue to send each other birthday cards, right? We can continue to try to keep up with each other and see each other at Christmas and celebrate. So ways of sustaining relationship, even in these times when we might not be able to really get over some of the grave and justifiable anger we've got from things that have decisions other people have made that impact us. Maybe a last thought in response to some of the things I see coming up. Again, these questions of how to be in relationship with people who are perceiving the world in a radically different way. I think where I struggle personally, and part of the reason why I've chosen the language of truthing, is I can pretty much find some sort of common space to be in dialogue with anybody who is who has a love for truth. Like if they really are longing to see the world as it really is, and they're really doing their best to speak honestly about what it is that they see, and there's somebody who's trying to hang in relationship. I find that then the differences that are between us are ones that are worth hanging in there with. Like we can continue to find a way in our relationship, and oftentimes those relationships can continue to be transformative of me, because I also need to be learning and growing and changing, right? I think where I really, really struggle is whether or not to continue in relationships where I don't see a desire to figure out what's real, or I don't see a desire to speak honestly, or I don't see a desire to hang in a relationship. And I think that's where it just gets super tough. So I'll put again up some resources as possibilities for where to go from here. Let me do another share screen. I'll say this book that I'm putting on the bottom here about redeeming conflict, that is my own best effort at what kinds of skill sets can I cultivate inside of myself to try to grow in my capacity to be in difficult conversations with people who like Nora is saying, or one of our other, like when someone has lied to me, like these are skill sets for hanging in tough conversations, not necessarily always being trusting, but being trustworthy myself in the conversation. A lot of the work that went into that was from research done with the Harvard Negotiation Project. And I would call out, there's a couple of really great books. One book that I just would put on everybody's radar is something called Difficult Conversations: How to Discuss What Matters Most. I'm not sure that I could be doing the work that I'm doing if I had not read that book. Like, it has helped me to hang in there with really tough relationships and not run away from conversations I find scary. Another book I found super helpful from the Harvard Negotiation Project is an old one, Getting to Yes, which is on negotiating and problem solving with people who I don't see eye to eye with. I would also really recommend that book as one to be in a library too. So hopefully these are the questions you're asking. These are hard questions. I don't have answers to them, right? But as much as possible, if we can keep educating ourselves around these skill sets, I think this is our own small part of truthing in the world today. Sister Margaret, let me hand things back over to you.
Okay, Ann. We are so grateful for what you've shared with us tonight. And, and I'm sure some of these books are going to be coming off the shelves, you can't see my camera, there we go. But I think these questions are so deep and so difficult and so critical. at this time that we really are so grateful for what you've given us tonight. I think of the characters for Emmet, you know, and you said they're trustworthy, they stand the test of time, they're sturdy, they stand up. And I think that's what you've given us tonight. There's a lot of insights that will stand the test of time, have stood the test of time. And you reminded us about a lot of things we know, but we don't think about too often. And so I thank you for that. I thank you on behalf of all of us. We are just very grateful, and it has just been a wonderful, wonderful event for us. We are so pleased. So thank you again, and we hope you'll get to Spark Hill and actually come and see and meet us in person. That'll be a goal. Next time you're in the New York area, you must come to us. Okay.
Thank you. And again, thank you for the witness of your lives of truth with each other.
And we thank everybody who has come tonight. We are grateful for your presence. We're happy that you were able to join us. We will be putting this on our YouTube channel, but it will take a little bit of time for our editing and so forth to get it up on there. So check our website and our YouTube channel. You can find it at the bottom of our website and see. And our other lectures that have taken place already on some really important topics are also available on that channel. So thank you again, and good night to all. And we are very grateful for your presence here tonight. Thank you.